My fiancé didn't leave me in a dramatic scene or a late-night argument. He left me quietly, logically, like I was a line item that no longer made sense. I didn't understand that at first. All I knew was that 6 weeks before our wedding, I was standing in his apartment kitchen in Seattle, staring at his phone, lighting up on the counter, and something inside me had already started to break. The message preview was short. Just enough. Your fitting is confirmed for Thursday. I still can't believe this is happening. It was from Claire, my Claire, the woman who had been my best friend since we were 21 when we met during our first job out of college. The one who helped me pack up my first apartment. The one who knew exactly how I took my coffee and exactly what kind of wedding dress I had bookmarked months ago. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe she was helping Ethan plan something, that maybe there was a surprise I didn't know about, that maybe somehow this still made sense. But my hands were already shaking when I picked up his phone. Ethan and I had been engaged for almost a year. We weren't the kind of couple who locked things away from each other. At least, I didn't think we were. His passcode still worked. The messages didn't start that day or that week. They went back months. I stood there, in that kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, too loud, in the silence, scrolling through conversation after conversation that I was never supposed to see. Plans layered over time, conversations that sounded careful at first, then easier, then certain. Claire wasn't just talking to him. She was stepping into my life. There were details about venues, places Ethan and I had visited together, notes about guest lists that included my family, even small things like fabric swatches and timelines, the kind of details you only discuss when you're building something real. And then I saw it, a photo Claire had sent. She was standing in front of a mirror, holding up a white dress. Not just any dress, the one I had saved from a boutique downtown. The one I had shown Ethan 3 weeks earlier, laughing about how it was probably out of budget, but worth trying on anyway. My stomach dropped so fast, I had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. I kept reading. At first, I was looking for an explanation, something that would make this smaller, less final. Something that would let me believe I hadn't completely misread the last 5 years of my life. Instead, I found something else, a pattern. Claire asking questions about Ethan's work, Ethan talking about his future, about the kind of life he wanted, the kind of people he needed around him. And threaded through it all, repeated subtle, at first, then unmistakable was the same idea. Compatibility, alignment, what made sense. I didn't see my name in those messages the way I expected to. Not as someone he loved, not as someone he was building a life with. Just someone who didn't quite fit. The apartment door clicked open behind me. I didn't turn around right away. I was still staring at the screen, at a conversation that felt like it had been written about someone else's life, until I realized it was mine. That the future I thought I was walking into had already been rewritten, and I was the only one who didn't know. Ethan didn't look surprised when he saw me standing in the kitchen with his phone in my hand. That was the first thing I noticed. Not panic, not confusion, just a pause, like he had reached the moment he'd been expecting, but hadn't quite known when it would arrive. "Hannah," he said, setting his keys down carefully on the counter, like this was a normal evening and not the unraveling of everything we had planned. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even feel like I was inside my own body anymore. "How long?" I asked. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, buying himself time. "It's not what you think." It was a sentence I'd heard in movies, in stories other people told. It had always sounded weak to me. Now it sounded rehearsed. I held up his phone slightly, not aggressively, just enough that he could see the screen. "Then tell me what I'm looking at." His eyes flickered to it, then back to me, and something shifted in his expression. The guilt didn't disappear, but it settled into something steadier. "Claire and I have been talking," he said. "About a lot of things." Talking. The word landed wrong. "About wedding venues?" I asked. "About guest lists. About my dress." He winced just slightly. "It didn't start like that. But it got there," I said quietly. He didn't deny it. That silence did more damage than anything he could have said. I set the phone down on the counter, between us, like it was evidence we were both required to acknowledge. We've been engaged for almost a year, I said. I met with a wedding planner this morning. I paid a deposit on a venue yesterday. When exactly did I stop being part of this? He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms, not defensive, contained. It's not about you stopping, he said. It's about realizing things. What things? That we weren't as aligned as we thought. Aligned. The same word from the messages. I felt something cold settle in my chest. And Claire is, I asked. He hesitated just long enough for the answer to already exist before he spoke it. On paper, yes. I let out a small brittle laugh before I could stop myself. On paper, I repeated. That's what 5 years comes down to. It's not just paper, he said, a little more firmly now. It's goals. It's lifestyle. It's understanding what kind of life you want to build. And I don't understand that. He looked at me, then really looked like he was trying to choose the right version of the truth. You understand your world, he said. But Claire, she understands mine. The room felt smaller. Your world, I said slowly. You mean the law firm, the partners, the clients. I've spent the last 3 years helping you host dinners for. That's not fair. No, I said. What's not fair is finding out that while I was building a life with you, you were building one with someone else. He pushed off the counter, pacing once, like he needed movement to stay steady. My parents like her, he said. She fits in with them. She knows how to move in those circles. There it was. Not hidden, not softened, just stated. And I don't, I said. He didn't answer. That silence again. I thought about every dinner, every conversation, every time I had stood beside him in a room full of people who spoke in quiet, measured tones about investments and partnerships and future plans. I had thought I was part of that world because I was with him. Now I understood. I had been adjacent to it, temporary. Does she know, I asked after a moment? About all of this. About me, he nodded. She didn't want to hurt you. The words landed with a dull weight. That's considerate, I said. He took a step closer. Hannah, we haven't, nothing physical has happened. This isn't, don't, I said, holding up my hand. I didn't need the details. The logistics didn't matter. What mattered was already clear. The life I thought I was building had been reassessed, restructured, and reassigned. And I had been the last person informed. I looked at the phone on the counter, one more time at the conversation that had quietly replaced me. Then I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't recognize the future I had once seen so clearly. I didn't remember leaving Ethan's apartment. One moment, I was standing in that kitchen, the phone still on the counter between us, and the next, I was outside the cold Seattle air, hitting my face like something sharp and real. I walked without direction for a while, past buildings I recognized, past restaurants where we had eaten, past a version of my life that only hours ago had still felt intact. My hands were still shaking when I finally stopped. There was only one person left to call. Claire answered on the second ring. Hannah, she said, her voice careful, controlled in a way I had never heard before. I was going to call you. I closed my eyes. Were you? I asked. A pause. I didn't know how she said. I leaned against the side of a building, pressing my palm flat against the cold brick just to steady myself. You didn't know how, I repeated. Or you didn't know when it would be convenient. That's not fair. No, I said quietly. What's not fair is finding out from a message on Ethan's phone that you've been planning to marry him. Silence stretched on the other end. Not confusion, not denial, just silence. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, finally softer now. The same words, the same tone, as if there was a version of this that could exist without harm. You didn't want to hurt me, I said. But you still went dress shopping. Another pause. I didn't go, she said. I just tried things on. I didn't buy anything. I let out a slow breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. That's your line, I asked. That's where you draw it. Hannah, she said. And now there was something else in her voice. Not guilt, exactly. Not quite. Something closer to justification. It's not as simple as you're making it. Then explain it to me. I waited, and this time she didn't hide behind vague words. You and Ethan were struggling, she said. You've been on different paths for a while. I thought about that. About the last year. The stress of planning a wedding while working long hours. The quiet disagreements about money, about priorities. But struggling wasn't the same as ending. You don't get to rewrite my relationship, I said. I'm not rewriting it, she said. I'm acknowledging what was already there. My grip tightened against the brick. And that justifies this, I asked. It explains it. There was a difference, and she knew it. I pushed off the wall, starting to walk again, not really paying attention to where I was going. How long, I asked. How long have you been talking to him like this? A few months, the same timeline as the messages. It didn't start like that, she added quickly. It was just conversations. About work, about life. Your dad, she stopped herself. But it was too late. I froze in place. My dad, what I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. He introduced the idea, she said finally. Not directly, just, he made some observations. Something cold and heavy settled in my stomach. What kind of observations? That Ethan needed someone who fit better with where he was going, she said. That you had different priorities. There it was again. Fit. Better. Different. Different how I asked. She hesitated. You've always followed what you love, she said carefully. Your work, your choices. That's admirable, but it's not always practical. The words were familiar. Too familiar. Not because Claire had ever said them before, but because someone else had. In passing comments, in small corrections, in the way my decisions were sometimes framed as temporary. You sound like him, I said. That's not fair, she said quickly. No, I said. It's accurate. I stopped walking. Cars moved past me. People crossed the street. The world kept going like nothing had shifted. But something had. Not just Ethan, not just Claire. A pattern, a way of looking at me that I had felt before, but never fully named. I thought you were on my side, I said, my voice quieter now. Not sharp, not angry, just tired. I am, she said. I want you to be happy. Then, why does this feel like you took something that was mine? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was almost gentle, because maybe it was never really yours in the way you thought. The words landed harder than anything else she had said. Not cruel, just final. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the dark screen after the call ended. Around me, Seattle looked exactly the same. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a place I belonged. I left Seattle on a Tuesday morning in late April. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. No last look at the apartment, no final conversation. No moment where everything felt resolved. Just a suitcase, a carry-on, and a boarding pass to Austin, Texas. The city looked exactly the same as it always had. That was the problem. I didn't want reminders. I didn't want familiar streets or shared places or the quiet possibility of running into someone who knew what had happened. I needed distance, not just from Ethan or Claire, but from the version of myself who had believed in that future. Austin was loud in a different way. Warmer, faster, a little less polished. The air hit me differently when I stepped out of the airport. Not sharp like Seattle, but heavy grounding. Real in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the east side. It wasn't impressive. The floors creaked. The kitchen was narrow. But it was mine. No shared memories. No ghosts, just space. I started my new job the following Monday. The company was a mid-sized event planning firm that specialized in corporate conferences. Nothing like the wedding industry I had once imagined for myself. No dresses, no vows, no curated perfection built around two people promising a future. Just schedules, logistics, deadlines. I told myself that was better, safer. My manager, Linda Perez, was in her late 50s, direct, without being unkind. She didn't ask about my past. She didn't try to read between the lines. She just handed me a project file on my second day and said, "We'll see how you handle pressure." Pressure, I understood. It was different from heartbreak, but not entirely unrelated. The first few weeks passed in a blur of early mornings and late nights, vendor calls, venue contracts, spreadsheets that stretched longer than they should have. It was demanding, structured, predictable. And for the first time, since everything had fallen apart, I could feel something close to control returning. Not over my life as a whole, but over the next hour, the next task, the next decision. Still, there were moments, small ones. A couple holding hands in a hotel lobby. A florist delivering arrangements for a private event. A conversation overheard about engagement rings. Each one hit like a quiet echo of something I had lost. I learned to keep moving, to redirect, to focus, to treat those moments like background noise instead of something I had to answer. By the end of my first month, Linda called me into her office. She closed the door behind me. Me sat down and studied me for a second before speaking. "You don't overreact," she said. "That's rare." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment. "You take information and process it and move on," she continued. "That works here." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much more than that. She slid a folder across the desk. "Bigger project," she said. "National Tech Conference. 3-day event. High expectations, tight timeline." I looked down at the file. It was heavier than the others. More detailed, more complicated. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you don't panic," she said simply. That wasn't entirely true. I just didn't show it. I took the folder, feeling the weight of it settle into my hands. Something shifted in that moment. Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. This wasn't about replacing what I had lost. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was just the next step. Later that night, back in my apartment, I set the file down on the small kitchen table and stood there for a while, staring at it. A new plan, a new structure, something that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time since I had left Seattle, the future didn't feel like something that had been taken. It felt undecided. The National Tech Conference landed in Austin in early June, and with it came the kind of pressure that left no room for self-pity. 3 days, 400 attendees, a keynote schedule that kept shifting because one panelist's flight was delayed out of Denver, and another insisted on revising his presentation less than 12 hours before he was supposed to go on stage. By the second morning, I had already replaced 2 vendors, reworked seating charts, and spent 15 minutes in a service hallway, talking a nervous junior coordinator through a near-tearful breakdown over missing name badges. It was the kind of chaos I had once hated. Now, strangely, I preferred it. Chaos with a checklist was still better than heartbreak with no edges. I first met Daniel Reed a little before noon on the second day of the conference. He was standing near the registration table in a navy suit, with no tie, talking to one of the AV technicians in the calm, focused voice of someone used to solving problems without making himself the center of them. I knew his name because it was on the speaker packet in my hand. Founder of a growing software company based in Austin, mid-30s, closing keynote. Important enough that half the sponsors wanted a photo with him and the other half wanted 5 minutes of his time. He looked up when I approached. "Daniel Reed," I asked. "That depends," he said. "Are you here with good news or a schedule change?" There was enough dry humor in it to catch me off guard. "I'm here to tell you, your green room was moved because another speaker decided he needed the larger one for his ego." A corner of his mouth lifted. "Then I appreciate your honesty." I led him down the hall toward the smaller room we'd reassigned to him. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet and close to the ballroom. The kind of practical solution most people accepted once they realized it wasn't personal. He glanced around, then back at me. "Yeah. This is fine," he said. "I promise I don't need imported water or a dedicated orchid arrangement." "Good," I said, "because I can probably get you coffee and a functioning microphone. Anything beyond that is a luxury." He smiled, then fully this time, and something in my chest loosened in a way I hadn't expected. Not attraction exactly. Not yet. Recognition, maybe. Competence meeting competence. No performance required. Over the next 2 days, our paths crossed repeatedly. A question about timing. A last-minute change to a press interview. a quiet conversation in the back of the ballroom, while another speaker ran 10 minutes over and threw off the lunch schedule. Daniel never spoke to me the way Ethan used to at events, like I was useful, but secondary. He looked directly at me, listened to the answer, and adjusted. That should not have felt rare, but it did. On the final afternoon, after his keynote wrapped and the last sponsor photos were finished, I found him near the exit, holding a paper cup of bad hotel coffee and looking more relieved than triumphant. "You survived," I said. "So did you," he replied. "I'm not sure which one of us had the harder job." "I had the clipboards," I said. "That usually means more power." He laughed softly, then hesitated. "I'm hosting a smaller strategy summit in September," he said. "Nothing flashy, just investors, partners, and a few clients. If I asked your firm to handle it, would that be insulting to your current project load?" It was a professional question. That was what made it matter. He wasn't flirting. He wasn't flattering me. He had watched me work and decided I was someone he trusted. For a second, I felt the old instinct rise, that reflex to step back, to keep everything clean and careful and emotionally sealed. The instinct that had been running my life ever since Seattle. Then I heard myself answer. "No," I said. "It wouldn't be insulting." His expression warmed, but he didn't push. "Good. Then I'll call next week." As he walked away, I stood there a moment longer than I needed to conference, binder still tucked under my arm, my pulse unexpectedly uneven. Nothing had changed in any dramatic sense, but something had shifted. Not because a man had noticed me, because for the first time since Ethan and Claire, I had said yes to something that belonged to the future instead of the past. And I knew standing there in the thinning crowd that I wasn't going back to who I had been. Daniel called the following Thursday morning, exactly when he said he would. No delay, no vague sometime next week, no shifting timelines. "Is this still a good time?" he asked when I picked up. It was a simple question, but it landed differently than I expected. "Yes," I said. "It is." We set up a meeting that afternoon at a small conference room in his office building downtown. It wasn't polished in the way Ethan's firm had always been. No marble lobby, no curated silence, but it was efficient, lived in, the kind of place where things actually got done. Daniel walked in with a notebook, not a laptop. "I like to see how people think before I see how they present," he said, setting it on the table. I nodded, understanding immediately. We spent the next hour going through the structure of his September summit. Smaller guest list, high-value conversations, no unnecessary spectacle, every detail tied back to purpose. It was different from the events I had helped Ethan with. Those had been about impression. This was about intention. Halfway through, Daniel paused and looked at me, not at the notes. "You don't overpromise," he said. "You tell me what's realistic." "That's the job," I replied. "No," he said. "That's judgment." Something about that settled into place. Not flattery, not evaluation, recognition. We finalized a preliminary plan by the end of the meeting. As I stood to leave, he hesitated for just a second. "Can I ask you something that's not about the project?" he said. I felt the instinct to deflect rise immediately, but I didn't move. "Okay," I said. "Have you always been this contained?" he asked carefully. The word wasn't wrong. It wasn't an accusation either, just an observation. I thought about it, about the last few months, about the version of myself I had become since Seattle. "No," I said. "Not always." He didn't press. "Fair enough," he said. "For what it's worth, it works for you. But it also looks heavy." I let out a small breath. Sometimes it is. We didn't say more than that. But something shifted. Not a breakthrough, not a confession, just a small adjustment in how much space I allowed someone else to occupy. Over the next few weeks, the project became a constant presence in my life. Emails turned into calls. Calls turned into in-person meetings. Site visits, vendor negotiations, timeline adjustments. Daniel stayed involved, but not controlling. He asked questions, made decisions when needed, and trusted the process when it made sense. It was steady, and that steadiness was unfamiliar. One evening in late July, we were reviewing layouts in a quiet cafe after a long site visit. The sun was setting outside, casting everything in that warm, golden light Austin seemed to specialize in. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying the draft in front of us. "This is going to work," he said. "It's exactly what I had in mind. Maybe better." I nodded, making a small note on the margin. "Good," I said. "That's the goal." He watched me for a moment, then said, "You don't take credit." "I take responsibility," I replied. He smiled faintly. "That's not the same thing." I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure anymore where the line was. My phone buzzed against the table. I glanced down without thinking. Unknown number, Seattle area code. For a second, I froze. A quiet, instinctive reaction I hadn't expected to still have. Daniel noticed. "You okay?" he asked. I turned the phone face down. "Yeah," I said. "Just wrong number." He didn't question it, but the moment lingered. Later that night, back in my apartment, I picked up my phone again and stared at the missed call. No voicemail, no message, just a number tied to a place I had deliberately left behind. For a long time, I had told myself that distance was enough, that leaving had been the end of it. But as I stood there in the quiet, I realized something else. The past didn't need permission to reappear, and this time, if it did, I wasn't going to disappear with it. The missed call from Seattle turned into an email 3 days later. I was at my desk on a Monday morning in early August, reviewing final catering numbers for Daniel's summit, when I saw Claire's name in my inbox. For a second, I just stared at it. Not because I didn't know who it was, because I did. Claire Whitman. Clean professional subject line. No drama. No apology in advance. Just an invitation attached as a PDF. As if what existed between us could be reduced to an event file. I opened it anyway. Cole Mercer Holdings was hosting its annual leadership reception in Seattle that fall, a polished corporate evening, tied to donor outreach, new partnerships, and the kind of social positioning Ethan had always taken seriously. His family's name was at the top of the page. Ethan's was listed on the host committee. Claire's too. I read that line twice. Then I opened the body of the email. It was brief. Claire wrote that she had heard I was doing well in Austin and that she wanted to extend the invitation personally. She said there would be people in attendance from several firms Daniel might eventually want to know. She said she hoped enough time had passed for everyone to be in the same room gracefully. Gracefully. That word irritated me more than it should have. Not because it was cruel, because it presumed the wound had become something decorative, something polished and manageable. I closed the email and sat very still. An hour later, Daniel found me in one of the smaller conference rooms with the summit floor plans spread out in front of me and absolutely none of my attention on them. "You've been staring at the same page for 10 minutes, he said. I looked up. "Have I?" "Yes." He sat across from me without making a production out of it. That was one of the things I had come to trust about him. He never rushed into silence like it was something to fix. "What happened?" he asked. I turned my laptop toward him. He read the email once, then again more slowly. "This is bold," he said. "That's one word for it. You think she's being sincere?" I let out a short breath. "I think she's being strategic," because that was the part I understood now. Not everything was emotional. Some things were positioning. Optics. The appearance of ease after damage had already been done. Claire wasn't offering peace. She was offering a stage. And if I showed up uncertain, hurt, or smaller than I used to be, that would tell its own story. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Do you want to go?" "No," I said immediately. Then I paused, because the truth was more complicated than that. I didn't want the room. I didn't want Ethan's face. I didn't want Claire's calm voice, or the polite surprise of people who had watched me disappear and might now enjoy measuring the difference. But I also didn't want them holding the final version of me in their heads. The one who left quietly. The one who vanished. "I don't know," I said. Daniel nodded once, as if uncertainty were a reasonable place to stand. "You don't owe them your presence," he said. "I know, but if you go," he added, "it should be because it serves you, not them." That was the sentence that stayed with me. All afternoon, I moved through meetings and calls, with the email sitting in the back of my mind like a pin under the skin. By evening, I understood why it had unsettled me so badly. Because it changed the shape of the future again. Until that moment, Seattle had been something behind me. Closed, painful, but finished. Now, it was asking to become present tense. That was the real risk. Not seeing them, letting them drag me back into the version of myself who had once stood in a kitchen, holding a phone, waiting for someone else to define what came next. That night, I reopened the email. Then I opened my calendar. If I was going back to Seattle, I wasn't going back by accident, and I wasn't going back alone. We flew into Seattle on a gray Thursday afternoon in mid-September, and the first thing I noticed was how quickly my body remembered what my mind had tried to put away. The air, the light, the particular stillness of the city before rain. Nothing dramatic happened. No panic, no tears, just a tightening low in my chest, like some part of me had been waiting all along to see whether I would come back as the same woman who had left. I wasn't. That was the only thing I knew for certain. Daniel rented a car, and we drove into the city in the quiet way people do when they both understand that conversation can wait. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't offer reassurance I hadn't asked for. He just reached across the center console once at a red light and squeezed my hand. It was enough. The reception was being held the following evening at the Mercer Grand Hotel downtown, the kind of place Ethan's family had always preferred: old money finishes, muted lighting, polished brass waitstaff who moved like they'd been trained never to make a sound. I stood in the hotel room before we left, looking at my reflection longer than I needed to. I had chosen a dark green dress, clean lines, no softness meant to invite interpretation. Daniel was buttoning his cuff at the window jacket slung over the chair behind him, steady as ever. "You can still decide not to do this," he said. I met his eyes in the mirror. "No. If I leave now, I'll turn this into something bigger in my head than it actually is." He nodded once. "Then we go and stay as long as you want and leave the second it stops serving you." That sentence settled me more than any comfort could have. When we walked into the ballroom, I felt the room before I fully took it in. Laughter, glassware, low music, the soft current of people networking in expensive clothes. No one noticed me at first. That helped. It gave me a few seconds to breathe, to let the space become real instead of imagined. A floral arrangement near the entry. A long bar along the left wall. Tables with donor cards and discreet centerpieces. It wasn't personal. It was corporate theater dressed up as elegance. Then someone near the registration table looked up. I saw the recognition happen in stages. Pause. Double take. Quick glance at the person beside them. And suddenly, the room didn't feel anonymous anymore. I kept walking. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just steadily. Daniel beside me, one hand resting light against the small of my back. Not possessive. Not performative. Present. I spotted Ethan before he saw me. He was near the center of the room speaking with two older men in dark suits. His posture exactly as I remembered. It controlled, attentive, slightly, angled toward whoever held the most influence. He looked sharper than the last time I'd seen him, but there was something harder around the mouth now. Less ease, more effort. Claire was across the room near the host display, wearing ivory silk and the kind of composed smile that suggested she had practiced it. For one strange second, I saw the whole thing the way an outsider might have. A polished event, a polished couple, a polished life. And because of that, the cracks were easier to spot. Ethan's eyes reached me first. I watched the moment recognition landed. His sentence stopped halfway through. One of the men beside him turned, following his line of sight. Claire noticed the shift and looked over too. No one moved right away. That was the first real change in the room. Not noise, not confrontation, interruption. I felt it move outward from us, in small ripples, attention, changing direction, conversations, thinning just slightly at the edges. Daniel leaned closer, his voice quiet. "You okay?" "Yes," I said, and this time it was true. Not because it didn't matter, because I could finally see it clearly. They were not the people who had ended me. They were just the people who had once mistaken my silence for weakness. Ethan started toward us, and this time I didn't feel the urge to run. Ethan stopped 3 feet in front of us, close enough for me to see that the composure I remembered on him was still there, but thinner now, more practiced, like something he put on before entering a room. "Hannah," he said. My name sounded strange in his mouth, familiar, but no longer belonging to him. "Ethan." His eyes shifted to Daniel, then back to me. "I didn't know you were coming." That was probably the point, I said. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face before he smoothed it away. Claire reached us a second later, her expression arranged into something warm and polished. She looked almost exactly the way she had the last time I saw. Her careful hair, understated jewelry, the kind of effortless elegance that had once made people assume she belonged wherever she stood. "Hannah," she said, with the same measured tone she had used in her email. "I'm glad you came." I looked at her for a second, then let the silence do what it needed to do. Beside me, Daniel remained still, one hand in his pocket, the other relaxed at his side. He didn't step in. He didn't perform support. He simply stayed where he was. Then, one of the older men Ethan had been speaking with approached smiling toward Daniel. "There you are," he said. "I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk tonight." Ethan turned slightly. "You know each other?" The man gave him a curious look. "Of course. Daniel and I have been trying to align schedules for weeks." He turned back to Daniel. "Arthur Keene," he said to me, and Claire, as if making introductions mattered now. "I'm on the advisory board at Cole Mercer. We're very interested in hearing Daniel's thoughts on the expansion proposal." For one quiet second, no one said anything. I watched the meaning land, not all at once, in layers. First Ethan, then Claire, then the subtle shift in the room around us as other people nearby recognized Daniel's name, his face, the direction of the conversation. The summit in Austin had told me enough to understand what was happening. Daniel's company had been growing fast, quietly, in ways that made established firms pay attention. Cole Mercer wanted access to that growth. They wanted credibility, leverage, proximity. And Ethan, who had once measured people by whether they fit the world he wanted, was now standing in front of the man whose attention his company wanted and whose respect he had not earned. Claire was the first to recover. "That's wonderful," she said, smiling at Daniel now. "We had no idea Hannah was seeing someone in your position. It was subtle, but not subtle enough. Your position, not your character, not your mind, not the fact that he had crossed the country because I mattered to him." Daniel looked at her with calm, unreadable politeness. "Hannah and I are together," he said. "That's the relevant part." Arthur, who was old enough and rich enough not to pretend he missed the tension, cleared his throat lightly. "Daniel, when you have a moment, I'd love to introduce you to the rest of the board." "Of course," Daniel said. Ethan finally found his voice. "You're working with Cole Mercer." Daniel's gaze moved to him steady and direct. "We've had conversations." Conversations. The same harmless word Ethan had once used to describe betrayal. This time, it landed differently. I saw it in his face. Not humiliation exactly. Something sharper. The realization that he no longer controlled the room he had built his life around. That access, influence, and relevance were moving in a direction he could not shape by choosing the right person. Claire's hand tightened around her glass. "You could have mentioned this," she said to me, and there was something strained under the smoothness now. I met her eyes. Why, neither of them answered. Because there was no good answer. Not one that didn't expose exactly what they had valued all along. Arthur gestured politely toward the far side of the ballroom, where several people were already looking our way. Daniel glanced at me first, a question without words. I nodded. He turned back to Arthur. "Lead the way." Then he looked at Ethan and Claire, not cold, not warm, just clear. "Good to meet you both." And that was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. The freeze wasn't shock that I had found someone. It was the far more unbearable recognition that the standards they had once used to dismiss me had turned against them. And this time, there was nothing either of them could say that would make them look right. As Daniel walked away with Arthur, I stood where I was for another beat, facing the two people who had once mistaken cruelty for logic. Ethan opened his mouth like he meant to say something. I didn't wait to hear it. For the first time, leaving felt like power. Daniel found me near the coat check a few minutes later, just as I was slipping my wrap over my shoulders. You left before Ethan could say whatever terrible thing he'd been rehearsing, he said. I looked at him, and for the first time that night, I laughed. Then I did the right thing. We stepped out of the Mercer Grand into the cold Seattle air, and the city felt different from the way it had the day before. Not softer, not kinder, just smaller somehow, less capable of holding power over me. Daniel signaled for the car, but neither of us moved right away. We stood under the hotel awning while traffic slid past in the wet shine of the street. You okay? He asked again. This time, I didn't answer quickly. I thought about Ethan's face when Arthur had mentioned the board, Claire's voice when she realized who Daniel was, the way both of them had reached instinctively for the same language they had always trusted, position, access, relevance, as if those things could still save them. I think so, I said. I thought it would feel bigger, and it doesn't. I let out a breath and watched it disappear into the cold. It just feels finished. That was the truth of it. The justice wasn't in embarrassing them. It wasn't in making a scene or saying the perfect cutting thing. It was in watching the logic they had used on me collapse under its own weight. They had chosen each other because it made sense on paper, because it looked right, because they believed life could be arranged like a seating chart and still mean something. And tonight, in the one room where those calculations were supposed to matter most, they had both looked uncertain. Not because I had ruined anything, because they finally had to stand inside the values they had chosen. The next morning, I met Linda in the hotel cafe before our flight back to Austin. She had flown in late the night before for a separate event and had only just heard where I'd been. She listened without interrupting, stirring cream into her coffee with the same calm practicality she brought to everything else. When I finished, she set the spoon down. So she said he traded stability for optics, and now he has optics without control. I smiled despite myself. That's a very Linda way to put it. It's also accurate. Then, she reached into her tote bag and slid a folder across the table. Daniel's summit went well, she said. Well enough that he recommended us for a much larger contract. Multi-city, next year. I stared at the folder. For a second, I couldn't speak. This was not a gift from the past. Not compensation, not proof to be held up in front of anyone. It was simply the next piece of the life I had built by walking away when staying would have made me smaller. By the time Daniel and I boarded our flight, the sky over Seattle had cleared. Somewhere over Oregon, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small velvet box. I turned to him, startled. It's not a performance, he said quietly. So, I'm not getting down on one knee in an airplane aisle. I laughed, already crying a little. He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, clean, elegant, nothing excessive. I'm not asking because of last night, he said. I'm asking because every version of my future that feels honest has you in it. No strategy, no image, no paper logic. Just you. Do you want that too? I looked at the ring, then at him. At the man who had never once asked me to become more acceptable, more polished, more strategic than I was. Yes, I said. Not because I had won, not because they had lost, but because I was finally standing inside a life that belonged to me. And when we landed in Austin, it was with a contract in my bag, a ring on my hand, and a peace I hadn't known was possible back in that Seattle kitchen when everything first broke. That was the real ending. Not revenge, not triumph, just the quiet, lasting relief of no longer needing the approval of people who had mistaken your worth for your usefulness. If you've ever had to walk away from people who only valued you when you fit their plans, I'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, you can subscribe, and join me for the next story about Justice Family and the long road back to yourself.